a hot movie and you think, wow, this kind of movie is now what I should be writing, you are behind the 8 ball. It is not going to work. They're not going to sell it. And they're going to tell you it's tired stuff. But I don't teach for or conduct workshops. I don't like to think of myself as a teacher. I like to think of myself as someone who can get you all to percolate and come up with ideas for yourself, to break any kind of shell that you have around yourself that keeps you from being as creative as you can be. So doing this exercise, tapping into your unconscious, you become what I call snowflakes. And that is, we are all individual and unique as snowflakes are. Somebody thought they found 2 similar snowflakes the other day, but they haven't proved it yet. So far as we know then, we are still as unique as snowflakes. And what all editors want, what all producers and directors want, is to find someone with an individual voice. By tapping into your unconscious, your deepest creative urges, you will automatically become unique and individual. So I urge you to try this exercise. This is also something you can do when you have written a novel, you've written a screenplay or a play, and you're stuck, you don't know, you've got a mass of material, you don't know what you're dealing with. It's a way to get a handle on your material. It's a way to flash on a scene that isn't working and begin to let your unconscious come into play here. It's reading the entrails of the scene and trying to figure out what the scene should be about. Okay so far? Okay.
Sid, would this help you if you feel like you're sort of a one-theme kind of person, like you just have this running thing that keeps on showing up and showing up and showing up?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, would this help you get something else going?
Well, if the theme that keeps showing up and showing up is a conscious theme, and if your subconscious says they're sick and tired of this theme, yes, you'll get something else. But it is not unusual for any body of work. Any skilled critic can find in any one writer's body of work a single theme buried under however different the story that seems to be spelling out. So that is not to worry about. You can ring changes on a single theme forever. And which reminds me about, I think the theme should be simply stated, and then you can create symphonies around it. But you need that basic theme in order to create the symphony. Yeah.
I got a question. Say you've done a whole story, a whole book, and you don't know where the problems are. How do you get in with this speed writing stuff and reading the entrails?
Well, one way, if you don't know where the problems are, that is a major problem. Then start talking to yourself about the material. If you're writing about the material, then different things will come out. And my suggestion always is write a review of the book you're trying to write. Write a review of the play or the movie you're trying to write. And do it professionally. You sit down, you put the title of the review, and you say, this magnificent novel by Robert Ray is what? You've got to answer that.
Your first stroke. Right?
That's right. That's when you come to a stop. What is it? The second thing, or you can go on and list adjectives for the next 3 paragraphs. Eventually, you are alerted to the fact that you've got a reader reading this review whom you hope will rush to the bookstore after reading the review and buy the book, but you have to sell them on it. And in order to sell them on it, you have to tell them certain things about the book, which forces you in turn to tell the story. And when you tell the story, maybe things then will drop into place as to what you have or have not done in the book.
Okay, and if you do know where the problem is with the scene, do you read the scene first, or you just sort of recollect what it was about?
Well, it depends on how close the scene is. Bradbury, who's a friend of mine and has been my guru for years, he intimidated me greatly years ago by saying, on a book I was having trouble with, put it aside, do not look at it, and from memory, rewrite the book. And I said, are you kidding? I mean, there's 580 pages there. And he said, I am not kidding. If there's anything you have forgotten when you rewrite it, it's there at your fingertips. You can search for it and put it in. But if you try to cut and patch, something, it becomes checkerboard and murder. I mean, it is just not a good way to go. And many times, if you force yourself to put aside the first draft and write it from scratch, you are then a giant step on the way to stating the theme, because everything will be simplified, because all of that first draft was probably the warm-up for the actual writing of the story.
When you say write down anything that pops into your head, does that mean just words, phrases, can be whole paragraphs?
It can be a whole paragraph. I've never met anybody who can think in paragraphs, though.
Not at white-hot speed.
Yeah. But it's all right if you do. I mean, but see, a paragraph becomes a piece of writing, and we don't want it to be a piece of writing. We want it to be vomiting on the page. That's a Bradbury expression also. Just get it up and let it...
I didn't know that was called creative.
Yeah, it is creative. Some critics would tell us that, in any case. But this is a good way also to start a piece of work, is to write a review of the book you hope to write, and then begin talking the story to yourself. The more artistic writers frequently say, no, I don't want to be pinned down to an outline. That's too rigid. I can't be creative. I don't know what's going to happen. And that's just backward to me, because an outline are merely guideposts, and you are given the security of knowing where you're going. That doesn't mean you know the ending necessarily. Doesn't even mean you know the beginning necessarily, because many times you don't write the beginning until you've written the ending, and vice versa. But it's part of the process to give you the security so that when you have an outline of the work, and that doesn't mean a rigid outline, that means this story you're telling in simple prose, you're talking about the story you're going to write, not writing the story. It can be as simple as arbitrarily dividing a long piece of work into 3 acts. That's just for organization's sake. That doesn't mean it stays in 3 acts. And Act 1 states the problem or the premise. Act 2 complicates it. Act 3 resolves it. I mean, this is simple talk. It doesn't mean you are bound to this in any way, but it helps you organize the material. My mind is disordered and chaotic, and it is only by devising these kinds of systems that I can bring any sense to myself. So arbitrarily, if it's a novel I'm writing, I'll say, okay, there's 3 acts, and I have 7 chapters in Act 1, 7-2, 7-3, and then I go through and say, well, this will happen in Chapter 1, just a line, 2 lines. And then by the time I get to Chapter 4, I have run out of ideas. I don't worry about that. I skip to Act 2, or maybe to Act 3, and say, I know what the end scene is. I've just had an intuitive flash. I know what's going to happen. But you try to fill as many of those blanks as you can. Everything will change in the writing, I guarantee you. But it gives you great comfort and security to have a kind of direction. And then when you start the writing, you are free to be creative. How can you be creative if all you're putting down is fumbles and false starts? And how can a piece of work be taught? Why should we force our readers to endure our creative musings? We don't want musings. And everything we're after is to tell the story. Everything is at the service of storytelling, I believe. I think fiction writers, and that includes movies and television, plays and novels, short story writers, are storytellers. It is no accident that the bestseller lists have these incredible plots. And for too many years, our critics have sneered at plot as though it were easy. And it is the most difficult part of writing, which is why they sneer at it, because they don't want to cope with that. They'd rather talk about characterization, and they'd rather talk about the style. The style is at the service of the material. The story demands a certain kind of style if you're going to write it. Style will take care of itself. The harder you work, the longer you work, the more your style takes shape. Don't worry about fine writing, especially in the first draft. Fitzgerald always went back in the last draft and put in all of his beautiful writing, not in the early draft. That just ties you up. You're too worried about, gee, does this sentence work? And there's a sparkler, and that's a good one, and I'll think of a metaphor, and all of that. talk about the story. And if you're having problems